When I saw my husband standing near the car, holding the scarf that didn't belong to him, or to us, I felt my entire body flush cold. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't accusing. He was simply looking. Looking at me in a way he hadn't looked in years. Like he was really seeing me, not the version of me he believed still lived in this house. And I froze. I didn't reach for an excuse or rush to close the trunk. I just stood there, keys in hand, heart rattling against my ribs. The scarf rested limp in his fingers, the wind teasing its corner. He didn't need to ask whose it was. He already knew. But not everything. Not the part about the drive. About the lake. About the night that fractured everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and myself. My husband blinked once, slowly, and then looked past me, as if through me. I wanted to say something, anything, but what do you say when you're caught with something that's not yours, yet explains so much of who you've become? I felt my palms sweat and my throat tighten. I wanted to turn back time, to undo the silence, the eyes I let linger too long, the smile I returned when I shouldn't have. But I couldn't. Not now. Not when it was all unraveling like the threads of that very scarf. What happened between me and my neighbor wasn't part of some plan. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't passion. It was loneliness. Familiarity. A whisper of the woman I used to be. And before I take you into the heart of this story, before I reveal the things I swore I'd take to my grave, tell me, have you ever kept something so secret, so buried, only to watch it surface when you least expected? Share where you're watching from, and let me show you how one ride changed everything. It started with silence. Not dramatic, not painful. Just the kind that stretches over years and settles like dust on picture frames. I had grown used to mornings where the only sound was the kettle clicking off and the low hum of my husband flipping through his tablet. We didn't argue. We didn't hurt each other. But we had become invisible to one another. I remember the day I first noticed the neighbor, not just saw him, but noticed. He was carrying paint cans from the back of his car, shirt slightly damp with sweat, and there was a stillness to him. A quiet, purposeful movement, so unlike my husband's constant pace. I don't know why I lingered at the window that day. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just there. He looked up at one point. Not a wave, not a smile. Just a glance. Our eyes met, and he nodded politely. I nodded back. That was all. But it stirred something I hadn't felt in years, an awareness of being seen. Later that evening, my husband asked if I had moved his keys. He didn't look up when he spoke, didn't wait for a real answer. It was routine. Everything between us had become that, automatic motions, recycled words. When I said I hadn't seen the keys, he just grunted and went back to his screen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of the neighbor. Because of the way I felt about being noticed. As if that nod had reminded me that I existed. That I was still a woman. That I hadn't faded completely. The next day, I saw the neighbor again. He was trimming the hedge that bordered our properties. I stepped out with a small bottle of water, out of politeness, I told myself. It's hot, I said, handing it over. He looked at me, really looked, and took it with a quiet thanks. His eyes were a kind of tired that matched mine. Not from lack of sleep, but from years of silence that no one ever acknowledged. That brief exchange might have been nothing. But when I went back inside, I changed my blouse. For no reason. Just because I wanted to feel better. My husband came home late that evening, as he often did. He sat down at the table, picked at his food, and asked if I had remembered to book his dentist appointment. I hadn't. I'd forgotten. Because I'd spent the afternoon rereading old journal entries, ones from years ago, when we were still new, still alive with possibility. I remembered how I used to write about little things he did, the way he fixed my chair without telling me, how he reached for my hand under the covers. But those pages were yellow now, and the handwriting felt like someone else's. I apologized. He didn't say anything. Just turned on the TV and reclined in his chair. The apology floated in the air, unanswered, unabsorbed. I began to notice more things after that. How often I checked the window when I knew the neighbor might be outside. How I paid attention to what earrings I wore to take out the trash. How I stood a little longer near the edge of the garden when I heard his car door slam. One afternoon, I was sweeping the patio when I tripped over the hose. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to make me curse under my breath and grab my ankle. Before I could get up, he was there. He must have seen it happen from his yard. "You all right?" he asked, bending down. I nodded, embarrassed. "Just clumsy." He offered his hand. I hesitated for half a second and then took it. His grip was firm, warm. He pulled me up with ease and didn't let go right away. "I'll bring you some ice," he said. "In case it swells." "No, it's okay." But he was already walking back to his porch. That night, I dreamt about that touch. Not in a romantic way. But in the way it lingered. The way it acknowledged my presence. My body. My fragility. I didn't tell my husband. A few days later, he asked me to drop off some papers at the city office. I said I could. I had nothing else planned. As I grabbed my purse, I saw the neighbor outside, adjusting his side mirror. "Heading into town?" I asked, not sure why. "Yeah," he replied. "Gotta handle some paperwork." "Want a ride?" The words were out before I could think. "I'm going anyway." He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Sure. That'd be nice." The drive started quietly. The kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just unfilled space. Then he put on some music. Old jazz. Something mellow. I didn't recognize the track, but it fit the mood. We talked. About books. About work. About how the town had changed. It felt effortless, like two people who had known each other in a different life and were just catching up. When I dropped him off, he thanked me. I nodded. Later that evening, when I mentioned the drive to my husband, he didn't even blink. "I hope traffic wasn't bad," he said, sipping his tea. I looked at him. At the man who used to notice everything about me, and now, didn't see me at all. I stood in the kitchen long after he went to bed. The clock ticked loudly. I touched my lips without realizing. They didn't feel kissed. But they felt remembered. And somehow, that was more dangerous. The next few days unfolded with an uncomfortable kind of clarity. My routine returned to its usual rhythm, mornings with silent breakfasts, afternoons filled with tasks I invented to stay busy, and evenings shadowed by the weight of what hadn't happened but very nearly did. Yet something had shifted inside me. Not a decision, not yet. But an awareness that couldn't be unlearned. The neighbor and I didn't speak after the drive. We exchanged polite nods over trimmed hedges and morning trash runs, but neither of us acknowledged what had passed between us, the ease, the warmth, the subtle tension in our silence. Then came the weekend. My husband had plans to play golf with old friends. He left early, dressed in his usual navy polo and khakis, kissed me on the cheek without meeting my eyes, and mumbled something about picking up groceries on his way back. I nodded, pretending I hadn't already made plans of my own. The truth is, I didn't make them consciously. They just fell into place. I went outside to water the plants, an act of escape more than necessity. The morning sun was mild, and I liked the way it painted shadows on the grass. As I stood with the hose in hand, I saw him again. The neighbor. He was dragging an old chair out to the curb, one of those rickety things that had probably lived on his porch too long. He noticed me watching and smiled. Just enough to be polite. I nodded back. "You're getting rid of that?" I asked, raising my voice a little. He paused, hands on the chair. "Yeah. It's lived its life." I hesitated. "If you're heading into town, I'm going that way too." He glanced toward the sky, then toward his car. "Actually, I am." It wasn't an invitation, not exactly. But it wasn't a refusal either. 10 minutes later, we were in the car again. It felt different this time. There was a shared quiet between us, not the awkward kind, but something deliberate. Like we both understood the edges of what we were stepping around. We didn't say much. I looked out the window and let my thoughts drift. We stopped at a small market on the edge of town. He said he needed a few things, and I didn't object. We walked separately through the aisles, occasionally meeting between displays of fruit or canned goods. There was nothing flirtatious in it. No playful glances. Just a strange and subtle gravity that kept pulling me into his orbit. Outside, he offered to buy me a coffee from the kiosk parked nearby. I said yes. I didn't want the coffee. I wanted the moment to keep going. We sat on a bench just past the parking lot. The coffee steamed between our hands. The wind rustled plastic bags and distant flags. I found myself watching the way his fingers curled around the paper cup, steady and sure. "You always this quiet?" he asked after a long pause. "No," I said, surprised by the honesty in my voice. "I used to be louder. Laughed more. Asked too many questions." "What happened?" I looked at him, and I didn't say marriage. I didn't say time. I didn't say I stopped mattering. Instead, I said life. He nodded. Not with pity, but with understanding. When we got back in the car, the sun was higher. We didn't speak again until we reached the street. He turned to me before getting out. "Thanks for the ride," he said. I nodded. "Of course." And then, without a word, we kissed. It was sudden and soft, not demanding, not desperate. But it happened. And in that single moment, the boundary I'd held so carefully began to dissolve. He pulled away first. Not out of guilt, but with a look that told me he knew exactly what it meant. He stepped out of the car, closed the door gently, and walked away. I sat there, hands on the steering wheel, heart pounding with a rhythm I hadn't felt in decades. When I finally returned home, I parked the car and sat for several minutes before going inside. The hallway was quiet. My husband wouldn't be home for hours. Still, I moved as if someone might see me. As if guilt had a form and could follow me room to room. I went upstairs and looked at myself in the mirror. Nothing had changed on the surface. Same hair, same skin, same eyes. But something underneath had shifted so violently, I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. I opened my drawer and pulled out a small jewelry box. Inside was a set of earrings I hadn't worn in years. I put them on. Not because of him, or the kiss, or what might come next. But because, in that moment, I wanted to see a version of myself I'd forgotten existed. That evening, my husband returned with groceries. He complained about the heat on the golf course, tossed the keys on the counter, and asked if I'd paid the utility bill. I nodded. He didn't notice the earrings. We had dinner. We watched the news. He rubbed his eyes and said he was tired. I said I'd be up soon. But I stayed in the kitchen after he went to bed. The silence felt heavier now, more like a choice than a consequence. I thought about the kiss. The coffee. The way the sunlight hit his face just before he said goodbye. I thought about how I used to measure my life in milestones, weddings, birthdays, anniversaries. Now I measured it in seconds. In glances. In almosts. I didn't know what I had started. But I knew it had already begun. The morning after the kiss felt quieter than usual. Not just in the house, but in my body. There was a stillness in my chest that wasn't peace, but the eerie calm that follows a storm, when everything looks the same on the surface, but you know something underneath has shifted forever. I moved through the kitchen slowly, making coffee I didn't want, listening to the mechanical drip as if it held meaning. My husband had already left for the office. His mug sat clean in the sink. He hadn't said much before leaving, only mentioned a meeting and that he might be late. It was a blessing, that silence. I couldn't have handled questions, not even casual ones. I walked out to the garden with my cup and stood near the edge, where the yard faded into his. The neighbor's car was gone. For a brief moment, I felt relief. I wasn't ready to see him. To look at him and try to act like nothing had happened. But as I stood there, sipping the bitter coffee, a wave of something heavier than guilt washed over me. It wasn't shame. It was memory. The kiss hadn't been wild or impulsive, it had been still, sincere, almost unbearably quiet. And that was what made it dangerous. It hadn't been born out of a fleeting moment, but out of something built over time, something I hadn't been willing to admit until too late. The rest of the day passed in pieces. I organized drawers that didn't need organizing. I folded laundry twice. I cleaned windows that hadn't bothered me in years. Anything to keep my hands moving, to avoid stillness, because stillness meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling. When the doorbell rang just after lunch, my heart jumped. It was too early for my husband, and no one ever visited without texting first. I opened the door to find a package on the mat. No sender, just our name and address scribbled in sharp pen. I picked it up, brought it inside, and set it on the kitchen table. I didn't open it immediately. I stared at it for several minutes, irrationally wondering if it might somehow be from him. But it wasn't. Inside was a replacement filter for our air purifier, something I had ordered a week ago and already forgotten. Still, the way it had arrived felt symbolic. Like a message from the universe reminding me that life would keep going, no matter how fractured I felt inside. That evening, my husband came home later than usual. He looked tired, drained from whatever politics filled his office. He kissed my cheek absently and headed straight for the shower. Over dinner, he mentioned a work conference scheduled for the following week. "Just 2 nights," he said, scooping rice onto his plate. "You'll barely notice I'm gone." I nodded. And I hated how quickly my brain registered the opportunity in his absence. That night, I sat alone on the couch, the television playing quietly, but I wasn't watching. My thoughts wandered to the bench at the market, the steam from the coffee, the feel of his lips. I should have felt guilt. Maybe I did. But it was buried beneath something more present, longing. Not for the man himself, necessarily. But for what he represented. For the version of myself I glimpsed when I was with him, the woman who laughed, who spoke freely, who felt noticed. The next morning, I didn't plan to see him. Truly. I went about my chores, stayed inside, and didn't glance toward his driveway even once. But around noon, when I stepped out to check the mailbox, he was there. Not in his yard, not pretending to water anything, but standing by the sidewalk, arms crossed loosely, looking up toward the sky. I paused. He saw me and gave a small nod, like a question more than a greeting. I hesitated, then walked over. Not to him, but toward the street lamp a few feet away, pretending to check something that didn't exist. We stood there for a moment, not facing each other, but aware. "I didn't mean for things to get complicated," he said quietly, his eyes still on the sky. "I know," I replied, keeping my gaze on the cracked sidewalk. "We probably shouldn't." "We won't." It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of intention. One we both knew might not hold. A silence followed, heavier than it should have been. He shifted slightly, then added, "Still. I don't regret it." That sentence hung in the air long after he walked away. I stood there for minutes after, watching the way his back moved as he disappeared into his house. There was something comforting in the fact that he didn't try to push for more. He wasn't chasing. He wasn't demanding. He was simply there. Like a mirror I hadn't meant to look into, but now couldn't unsee. Over the next few days, I avoided him. Deliberately. I adjusted my walking schedule. I stopped stepping into the yard unless it was late, or early, or when I could be sure he wasn't out. It didn't help much. The ache remained. One afternoon, while I was sweeping the porch, a car pulled up across the street. A friend of my husband's stepped out and waved. "Thought I'd drop off those books I borrowed," he said. He mentioned them last week. We chatted briefly. He handed me the books and commented on the weather. But just before he turned to leave, he glanced toward the neighbor's house and said, "That guy's quiet. Doesn't say much. Heard he used to be a teacher." I smiled politely, but I felt my stomach tighten. It wasn't suspicion in the man's voice. Just curiosity. Still, the idea that anyone might be noticing, watching, was enough to reignite my panic. That night, my husband found me standing in the hallway, staring at an old photo of us on vacation, taken 10 or maybe 15 years ago. We were laughing. I had forgotten what that felt like. He stood beside me and looked at it too. "That was a good trip," he said softly. I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. "We should do that again. Take time." I wanted to tell him that time wasn't the problem. That presence was. That feeling like I mattered wasn't something a vacation could fix. But I stayed quiet. Later, lying in bed beside him, I felt his hand graze mine. A gentle touch. Familiar. Unremarkable. I closed my eyes and let my breath slow. I wasn't thinking of my neighbor. I was thinking of the version of myself that had once reached for that hand in joy, not obligation. I missed her more than anyone else. The following week began with rain. Not the dramatic kind, but a steady drizzle that blurred the windows and made everything outside feel distant. It was the type of weather that asked you to stay in, make tea, and pretend the world could wait. I tried to do just that. I really did. I had no intentions of seeing him again. Not out of anger or fear, but because I believed that distance could fix things. That if I simply stayed away long enough, the feelings would wither like cut flowers. But feelings, as I was learning, didn't obey time or logic. They stayed rooted, quietly stretching themselves into the corners of your life. My husband left for his work trip on Thursday morning. He packed the night before, carefully folding his shirts and asking if I had seen his blue tie. I helped him find it, tucked under a winter scarf in the hallway closet. He kissed my forehead before leaving, his lips dry and light, like a habit remembered out of politeness. When the door closed behind him, I didn't feel free. I felt something worse, possibility. The house felt larger without him. The silence wasn't new, but now it echoed. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching the edges of furniture, pausing at windows. I kept telling myself I wouldn't do anything. That I'd read, or bake, or maybe call an old friend. Instead, I wandered. By mid-afternoon, the rain had slowed to a mist. I stood at the window, watching droplets race each other down the glass. I didn't see him, but I knew he was home. I could sense it, the way you sense a shift in air before a storm. Around 4, my phone buzzed. It was a short message: "If you need to get out for a bit, I'm heading to the lake." Just driving. I stared at it for a full minute. Then I put the phone down and walked away. I cleaned the kitchen. Rearranged the spice cabinet. Watered plants that didn't need watering. But eventually, my eyes returned to the counter. To the phone. To the message still glowing. I didn't respond. I just grabbed my coat and keys and left. The lake was 20 minutes away, quiet, out past the edge of town, a place where people rarely went unless they were fishing or thinking. We'd spoken about it once in passing. I didn't know he remembered. When I arrived, his car was already there, parked beneath a tree that was just beginning to show signs of fall. Leaves scattered across the hood like soft confessions. I parked a few feet away. Neither of us moved at first. We just sat there, engines off, silence thick. Then he stepped out. I followed. We didn't speak as we walked. The path to the water was muddy in places, and we stepped carefully, like we were trying not to disturb something fragile. When we reached the edge, he stopped and looked out at the lake. The surface was smooth, mirroring the gray sky above. The air smelled of wet leaves and earth. A breeze lifted strands of my hair and pressed them against my face. "I almost didn't send the message," he said finally. "I almost didn't come." We stood in that thin space between honesty and restraint, neither of us daring to move closer. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said was already pulsing in the air between us. I picked up a small stone and tossed it into the lake. It landed with barely a splash. He did the same, and we watched the ripples overlap. "You ever think," I said quietly, "about how many choices we make just to feel a little less lonely?" "All the time," he replied. The wind picked up, and I hugged my coat tighter. He took a thermos from his bag and poured 2 cups of tea, offering one to me. I accepted it without a word. We sat on a bench a few feet back from the shore. The wood was damp, but I didn't mind. The warmth of the cup grounded me. "I'm not trying to ruin anything," he said after a pause. "I know this is complicated." "I'm the one who kissed you," I said. "Don't pretend this is all on you." His eyes met mine. They didn't plead. They didn't apologize. They simply held me, steady and quiet. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted. "Neither do I." The tea cooled in my hands, but I didn't drink. My thoughts circled in loops, each one landing in the same place. I couldn't go back. Not fully. Something inside me had cracked open, and no matter how I tried to stitch it closed, the air kept seeping in. I told myself I'd leave soon. That I'd get in the car and drive home, make dinner, read a book. But time slipped past us like mist over the water, and when I finally stood, I didn't want to. He didn't ask me to stay. I didn't ask him to follow. But we walked back to our cars together, not touching, not speaking. The goodbye was in the silence, and we both understood it wouldn't last. When I got home, I washed the mug he'd handed me. I changed into a different sweater. I lit a candle I hadn't used in months. Small rituals, trying to reclaim a version of myself that felt steady. Later that night, I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair. I looked for guilt, for shame, for something that would anchor me back to what was right. But all I saw was a woman trying to remember who she was before she forgot how to feel. The next morning, the sky was clear. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, bright and indifferent. And still, I felt like I was standing at the edge of something vast and irreversible. The first thing I noticed that morning was how still the house felt. Not quiet, still. As if everything inside it was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. My husband wouldn't be back until the evening. I had the day to myself, and yet, nothing about that felt relaxing. I moved through the hallway slowly, trailing my fingers along the wallpaper, trying to find some sense of normalcy in the texture of familiar things. I had dreamt of the lake. Not in images, but in feelings. The wet bench beneath me, the cool steam rising from the tea, the sound of water folding into itself. It stayed with me even after I opened my eyes, as if the echo of that place had followed me home and taken root. By mid-morning, the ache in my chest, one I had convinced myself I could silence, was back. Not the ache of guilt, but the ache of awareness. I had felt something real out there. Not grand or cinematic. Just real. And now I couldn't unfeel it, no matter how much I tried to distract myself with folded towels and grocery lists. I spent the early hours cleaning the guest room, a space that rarely needed attention. It was mostly for show, neatly made bed and used books, a lamp that hadn't been turned on in months. I dusted everything twice. Not because it needed it, but because my mind needed the noise. Around noon, I stepped outside to water the plants. The sky was overcast again, but the rain hadn't returned. I welcomed the heaviness in the air. It mirrored the way I felt inside, dense, suspended, waiting. I didn't expect to see him. He was in his yard, kneeling beside a bush with pruning shears in hand. He looked up when he heard the creak of my watering can. Our eyes met for the briefest second. Not an invitation. Not a question. Just a shared knowing. I turned back toward the house, but before I stepped inside, I heard him call out softly. "Did you sleep at all?" I paused, not looking at him. "Not really." "Me neither." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words felt too sharp in my mouth. I disappeared inside and closed the door behind me. I tried to stay busy after that. I rearranged drawers. Wrote out a list of things we didn't need. Checked the fridge 3 times without taking anything out. I couldn't keep still, and I couldn't calm down. The knock came just before 2 p.m. It was soft. Tentative. The kind of knock that says, "I'll go away if you don't answer." But I did. He stood there with a brown paper bag in his hand and a look that wasn't confident or sure, just open. "I made too much lunch," he said. I hesitated, my hand still on the doorframe. "You think this is a good idea?" He looked down. "No." We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything between us thick in the air. "Come in," I said finally. We didn't sit in the living room. Too formal. We stood in the kitchen, both of us leaning against opposite counters. He unpacked the bag slowly, placing 2 sandwiches on napkins and a small container of soup between us. "I didn't come for anything," he said. "I just wanted to see you." I didn't answer. I picked up the sandwich and took a small bite, chewing carefully, grateful for the distraction. We ate quietly. The kind of quiet that carries tension with it. He looked around the kitchen a few times, his eyes lingering on the little things, photos on the fridge, the chipped edge of the counter, the timer on the oven blinking the wrong time. After we finished, he packed up the leftovers and set the bag by the door. "I should go," he said. I nodded, but I didn't move. Neither did he. He took a breath and stepped closer. Not to invade. Just enough that I could see the lines near his eyes, the worry in his brow. "I don't know where this leads," he said. "But it's the first time in a long time I feel like I'm awake." I swallowed hard. "You shouldn't say that." "It's the truth." The silence between us stretched. And then, with nothing more than a glance, we kissed. Just once. Soft. Like a sentence left unfinished. He pulled back and looked at me, but said nothing. He didn't need to. A moment later, he picked up the bag, turned, and walked out the door. I stood in the kitchen long after he left. The room felt altered, even though nothing had changed. I traced the rim of my empty cup with my fingertip, feeling the edge over and over again. When my husband came home that evening, I was already in the kitchen, preparing dinner. He greeted me with his usual routine, coat on the chair, keys in the dish, a short summary of his trip. I nodded in the right places, asked the right questions. He didn't notice anything different. Or if he did, he didn't say. We sat at the table together. He asked if I'd been out, and I told him I stayed in. It wasn't a lie. Not technically. After dinner, he went to shower. I stayed in the kitchen, scrubbing a pan harder than necessary, the water running too hot. My reflection in the window was blurry, but I stared at it anyway. What I felt wasn't excitement. It wasn't passion. It was fear. Not of being caught. Of being changed. Of not knowing how to go back to the woman I was before I opened the door that afternoon. Before I let someone see me. Touch me. Remind me that I was still capable of longing. That night, lying beside my husband, I watched the ceiling in the dark. I could hear his breathing slow as he fell asleep. I turned on my side, my back to him, and let the silence settle once more around me. But it didn't feel the same anymore. It felt like the edge of a cliff. And I didn't know if I was standing still or already falling. The days that followed blurred into one another in a way that made time feel thick and strange, as though I were moving through something viscous instead of air. My routine stayed the same: wake up, dress, make coffee, tend the plants, but everything underneath them had changed. I wasn't floating anymore. I was holding something I couldn't put down. I kept waiting for something external to interrupt the quiet. For my husband to say something different, to notice the way I stared longer out the window or how I folded laundry without speaking. But he didn't. He stayed predictable, steady, and that steadiness made the tension inside me feel even sharper. He didn't ask questions. And I didn't offer answers. It was around midweek when the first sign of scrutiny arrived, not from him, but from outside. I was leaving the house to collect a parcel when I saw our neighbor from across the street, an older woman who spent most of her days in the garden. She waved as I passed, as she always did, but something about her smile felt different. Not unkind, just observant. "Getting out a lot lately," she said, in the tone people use when their words mean more than they claim. I smiled back politely, then kept walking. But I felt it, the unease of being seen. Not just noticed, but watched. As if the privacy I'd been clinging to was wearing thin at the edges. Later that afternoon, I ran into a friend of mine at the market. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, comments about the weather and the price of produce, but just as we were parting ways, she touched my arm lightly and said, "You look different." In a good way. Like, lighter. I forced a laugh, made some vague joke about drinking more water, and quickly stepped away. But the comment lingered. Had I changed so visibly? Was it guilt hiding poorly beneath my skin, or something else entirely? That evening, while putting away dishes, I caught sight of myself in the microwave's reflection. I didn't see guilt. I saw confusion. I saw a woman trying to live two lives inside one body. My husband came home early that night. He walked in with a small bouquet of flowers, nothing extravagant, just daisies and a few sprigs of greenery. I stared at them as he handed them to me, surprised not by the gesture itself, but by how foreign it felt in his hands. "You've seemed a little tired lately," he said. "Thought these might help." I managed to thank you and placed them in water, setting the vase on the kitchen table. We stood there in silence for a moment, him watching me avoiding his eyes. That night, as I lay beside him, I tried to remember the last time I had felt something in his touch. Not comfort or familiarity, but desire. The absence of it had become normal. But now, after everything, I couldn't stop noticing its lack. I began to avoid the window facing our neighbor's house. Not because I didn't want to see him. Because I wanted to too much. I walked different routes when I took out the trash. Watered the garden at dusk instead of midday. Rearranged the bookshelf just so I wouldn't glance toward his yard. But despite the avoidance, I thought about him constantly. And then, 2 days later, came the moment I had tried so carefully to prevent. It was morning. My husband was leaving for work and paused at the front door, rummaging in his bag. He realized he had forgotten some documents and asked if I could bring them to his office after lunch. I agreed automatically. As I was gathering the papers later, I remembered that one of them was likely left in the glove compartment of our car. I grabbed the keys and headed out, moving quickly, my thoughts elsewhere. When I opened the car door, the scarf was still there. Not mine. His. Left behind after the last ride, when the day was colder and the air near the lake had made our breath visible. I froze. It was rolled up neatly, partially tucked under the passenger seat, the color unmistakably his. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. My mind was already racing, trying to come up with a reason. A lie. A coincidence. Then I heard the door behind me open. My husband stood on the porch. He looked at me. At the car. At my hand clutching the scarf. There was no accusation in his eyes. Not yet. Just confusion. A slow dawning recognition that something didn't align. "What's that?" he asked. I hesitated, realizing too late that any answer I gave now would sound rehearsed, hollow. "Just a scarf," I said. "Must have been left behind from someone I gave a ride to." "Who?" The pause stretched too long. "Someone from the store," I lied. "I gave a lift home a few days ago." He didn't press. He just nodded slowly, lips tightening. But I could see the doubt forming. Not from anything specific. Just from the weight of everything unsaid between us. That night, we didn't speak much. He ate quietly. I pretended to read. The scarf stayed in my bag, folded neatly, like a relic I didn't know what to do with. The following morning, he was gone before I woke up. His side of the bed already cold. I stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm. I watched the garden through the window. There were no signs of life on the other side of the hedge. His curtains were drawn. I should have felt relief. But all I felt was the unmistakable pull of something I hadn't chosen, but had stepped into willingly. And now, there was no pretending the line hadn't been crossed. There was only the question of what would come next. The scarf stayed in my bag for 2 days. I moved it once, briefly, to retrieve my wallet at the grocery store. My fingers brushed the fabric, and a shiver climbed up my arm as if memory itself had texture. I didn't take it out. I didn't throw it away. I couldn't. Those 2 days passed in a haze of polite silence at home. My husband seemed distracted, but not confrontational. He mentioned a work meeting, a clogged drain in the guest bathroom, a call from his sister. His tone was neutral, his gaze soft but distant, as though he was trying to read the air between us but couldn't find the page. And I let him stay there, because I didn't know how to rewrite the truth either. On the 3rd morning, I found a note on the fridge, going into the city overnight for a meeting. Back tomorrow evening. I stood in the kitchen with the note in one hand and a spoon in the other, suspended between thought and action. I read it again and again. There was no time. No explanation. Just space. Just absence. I should have used the time to reflect. To rest. To come clean. But I didn't. Instead, I put the spoon in the sink, folded the note neatly, and placed it on the counter. I moved through the rest of the day pretending I was someone who had everything under control. I cleaned surfaces that were already clean. I organized books by color, not subject. I changed the sheets. I opened all the windows, then closed them an hour later when the air turned cool. I wasn't planning anything. Not exactly. But when the sun began to lower and the shadows stretched long across the floor, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, holding a dress I hadn't worn in years. It was dark blue, simple, with a cut that hugged softly at the waist. I used to wear it to dinners, to places where I felt I needed to look like I mattered. I put it on slowly, like a ritual. I didn't wear perfume. I didn't style my hair. But I did sit on the edge of the bed for a long time, hands folded in my lap, staring at the floor and listening to the quiet hum of the house. Eventually, I stood, picked up the scarf from my bag, and placed it gently into a small paper bag. I folded it once. Then again. As if doing it neatly would make the gesture mean less. I left the house just after 6. The air was mild, touched with the smell of cut grass and cooling pavement. I walked, not drove. The short distance between our homes never felt shorter than it did then. When I reached his door, I hesitated. For the first time in weeks, I wondered if this was the moment I should turn back. If this was the line I had one final chance not to cross. But I knocked. He opened the door quickly, as if he'd already been standing there. His face said everything. Surprise. Relief. Worry. And something gentler, harder to name. I didn't speak. I just handed him the bag. He took it and stepped aside, silently inviting me in. Inside, the room was dim but warm. Lamps lit the space softly, casting golden hues on the walls. It didn't smell like anything in particular, maybe wood, maybe paper, but it felt safe. He set the bag down on the table without opening it. "You didn't have to bring it back," he said quietly. "I know." There was a pause between us, thick but not heavy. "You want tea?" he asked. I nodded. We moved into the kitchen together. I watched as he boiled water, his movements familiar now. Unrushed. There was something calming in the way he did everything. Like nothing ever needed to be hurried. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, 2 cups between us, the air filled only with the soft sounds of evening through the open window. He looked at me for a long time. Not waiting for words. Just taking me in. "I didn't expect you," he said eventually. "I didn't expect myself." He didn't ask questions. He didn't push. And maybe that's why I stayed. We talked. About the garden, the weather, an article he'd read about restoring old furniture. Mundane things. Easy things. But beneath it all, every sentence carried the weight of the unsaid. Every pause was a question neither of us had the language to ask. At one point, I leaned back against the cushion, my eyes closing briefly. I didn't want to fall asleep. I just wanted to stop thinking. "I could drive you home," he offered gently. I opened my eyes. "Or I could stay a little longer." He didn't answer. But he didn't argue. The hours passed without markers. No phone calls. No clocks. Only the slow dimming of light through the windows. And then, without fanfare or tension, without explanation or plan, it happened. We spent the night together. There was no drama in it. No movie scene. Just 2 people in a room where silence had grown so full, it overflowed. When I woke the next morning, the sky was pale blue, and the sun was just beginning to warm the tops of the houses. I lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet. The kind that only comes when you've done something irreversible. He was still asleep beside me, breathing steady. I stood carefully, dressed without a sound, and stepped into my shoes like a stranger. At the door, I paused. The paper bag with the scarf still sat on the table. He hadn't touched it. I didn't take it back. I left the house with the weight of the night pressed deep into my spine. The walk home felt longer than it ever had. The world looked exactly the same. Lawns, driveways, wind chimes gently swaying in the breeze. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. When I stepped through my front door, the house greeted me with stillness. I moved into the kitchen, turned on the kettle, and stood waiting as it began to hum. The day had started. But I no longer knew where I stood in it. I had hoped the morning after would bring clarity. It didn't. It brought stillness, the kind that settles in after the wind stops, when everything is upright and intact, yet somehow shifted. The kettle clicked off before I remembered I'd turned it on. I poured the water, then let it sit untouched. I couldn't tell what I felt. It wasn't regret, not yet. And it wasn't joy. It was more like standing in an unfamiliar hallway with too many doors, each leading somewhere I wasn't ready to go. I walked slowly around the house, touching the back of chairs, opening drawers I didn't need, listening to the quiet rhythm of my own footsteps. My husband was due back that evening. The note on the fridge was still there, a polite reminder that time hadn't paused to let me catch up. I didn't know what he would sense, if anything. That was the part that disturbed me most, not the act itself, not even the possibility of being caught, but the thought that he might not feel a difference at all. That I could have crossed this line and returned to him unchanged, unnoticed. The day moved forward without asking what I wanted from it. I folded laundry. I answered 2 emails. I watered the plants too much. Every task felt mechanical, performed by someone impersonating a calm woman. At around 2 in the afternoon, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Too early. Too soon. I froze in place near the sink, a towel clutched in my hand like a lifeline. But it wasn't him. It was a delivery van, dropping off a package that wasn't even for us, wrong address. I exhaled slowly, my knuckles white around the fabric. That moment, meaningless in itself, revealed how tightly wound I had become. How every sound now carried the thread of revelation. At 4:30, I showered and changed, not because I felt dirty, but because I needed the ritual of water. To rinse off the night, to try and separate what had happened from who I was before it did. But nothing really washed away. The mirror reflected the same woman. Same hair, same eyes. But now they held a secret. By 6, he was home. I heard his keys in the lock, the door opening, his familiar footsteps crossing the threshold. He called out my name casually, like always. I answered from the kitchen, voice even, hands drying a plate that didn't need drying. He stepped in and placed his bag down. We greeted each other like people do after a brief absence. A kiss on the cheek. A polite exchange. His eyes were tired. He mentioned traffic. I nodded. The normalcy of it all felt like a trap. We ate dinner at the table, the 2 of us facing each other with a plate of grilled vegetables and leftover rice between us. I asked about the meeting. He talked more than usual, detailing office politics and hotel food. I listened. Asked a few questions. Smiled where appropriate. I was present. At least, I think I was. But there was one moment, small, almost forgettable, when he paused. He looked at me for a beat too long. Not suspiciously. Just curiously. as if he was trying to place a sound he couldn't name. I didn't flinch. I returned his gaze until he looked away. That night, in bed, he touched my arm. Lightly. Almost without thinking. A habitual gesture. I didn't pull away. But I didn't lean in either. I lay there, eyes closed, measuring my breath, counting the seconds between silence. When I woke the next morning, he was already gone again. A note on the counter. Early call. Be home late. Love you. 3 words. I stared at them longer than I should have. Not because I didn't believe he meant them, but because I wasn't sure if I still did. I went for a walk to clear my head. The neighborhood was quiet, trimmed hedges, cars parked neatly in driveways. I passed houses with open windows, music drifting out, the smell of toast or laundry detergent filling the air. Lives continuing, oblivious. When I returned, I paused at the edge of our yard. From where I stood, I could see into the neighbor's house. The curtains were pulled halfway open. A stack of books on a side table. A mug. No movement. I didn't go to his door. But I didn't go inside mine either. I sat on the steps, elbows on my knees, eyes unfocused. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Midday passed with slow heaviness. I ate a piece of fruit and forgot what kind. I checked my phone without really reading anything. At some point, I lay on the couch and watched the ceiling, tracing patterns in the plaster like a map to somewhere I'd never been. In the late afternoon, I stepped into the garage to look for an old picture frame I'd meant to repair months ago. While digging through the shelves, I knocked over a bag, an old canvas tote filled with things I hadn't seen in ages. Inside was a photo album from our first years in this house. I carried it to the dining table and sat down. Dust rose when I opened it. Each page held moments I had forgotten, laughing over paint cans, standing in the backyard with muddy shoes, birthdays with badly made cakes. His arms around me. My hand on his chest. I stared at one picture in particular. We were both younger, eyes brighter, holding coffee mugs on a cold morning. I remembered the moment clearly, how he had made a joke about my hair sticking up, and I had thrown a dish towel at him. We had been happy then. Hadn't we? The ache hit me suddenly, unexpectedly. I closed the album and pressed my palm against it as if to contain everything inside. Memory. Loss. The quiet erosion of something once whole. I left it there and returned to the living room. Evening light was pouring in, turning the walls gold. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the vase of now-dried daisies on the table, his gift from days ago. They were still upright. Still holding shape. But their petals had crisped at the edges. Later that night, when he came home, we sat together again. Another dinner. Another conversation. He told me about a friend's retirement, about needing to fix the garage light. I nodded. But that same pause came again, his eyes searching mine just a moment too long. Still, he said nothing. And I realized something I hadn't before. It wasn't just that I had crossed a line. It was that I had walked so far from it, I no longer knew how to find my way back. The weather changed the next morning. A soft breeze moved through the curtains as if the house had exhaled overnight. I opened the windows and let it in. The air smelled like distant rain and something unfamiliar, like new beginnings, or the warning of them. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, watching the trees shift in slow motion. The calendar on the fridge told me it was Thursday, but it could have been any day. Time was beginning to lose shape. My husband had already left for work. Another note on the counter, don't forget about the plumber. Love you. I read it twice. The handwriting was a little rushed, but still recognizable, years of repetition, the same slant, the same looping why. It struck me how even the smallest parts of him had become routine, predictable, known. I made tea but didn't drink it. I walked the house again, this time not out of restlessness, but because I needed to remind myself where I lived. Each room still held pieces of us as photos, furniture we picked out together, a dent on the hallway wall from when we tried to move the bookshelf ourselves and failed. I ran my fingers across those things like they were evidence. Evidence that we'd been real. But the weight of what had happened, what I had done, sat with me like a second shadow. It followed me into every corner. At noon, I went outside to sweep the porch. It was warm but not hot, the kind of day that draws people out of their homes. The street was calm, a few neighbors tending to their yards, the sound of a mower in the distance. I focused on the movement, brush, step, hoping that the rhythm might drown out the noise in my head. That's when I heard it, his car. I didn't turn around immediately. I kept sweeping, slower now, pretending I hadn't noticed. But I felt him. I always did. He parked across the street, stepped out, and paused by his mailbox, pretending to sort through letters that probably didn't matter. I glanced up, just once, and our eyes met. There was no smile. No wave. Just a stillness, a recognition that carried too much weight for public spaces. He looked tired, like I probably did. We held the moment, then let it go. He turned and walked inside. I went back to sweeping. But the energy stayed with me all day. I didn't see him again that afternoon. But in the early evening, as the sun began to set and the world softened into shadows, something shifted. My husband came home later than expected. He looked distracted, set his bag down gently, and leaned against the kitchen counter while I finished cooking. I asked about his day. He gave me half answers. His eyes didn't meet mine. We sat down to eat. The food tasted like nothing. Halfway through the meal, he set his fork down and cleared his throat softly. "There's something I need to ask," he said, his voice steady but quiet. I froze for a moment, not visibly, but enough to feel it. I wiped my mouth slowly with the napkin and nodded for him to go on. "Have you been all right lately?" It wasn't the question I expected. It wasn't even accusatory. But it landed like a stone in my chest. "I mean," he continued, "you've seemed distant. Tired. I don't know. Just somewhere else." I opened my mouth, but nothing came. My throat tightened around words that didn't know how to form. He watched me, waiting. Not demanding. Just watching. "I've been thinking a lot," I finally said. "About things. About us." His eyes dropped to the table. "Should I be worried?" he asked after a pause. I couldn't lie to him. Not directly. Not anymore. But I also couldn't tell him the truth. Not now. "No," I said softly. "Just tired. Just a little lost." He nodded, slowly. Not convinced, but not ready to dig deeper either. The rest of the evening passed quietly. He watched television. I folded laundry. We brushed our teeth side by side without speaking. When we climbed into bed, he reached for my hand. I let him take it. I didn't sleep much. At some point during the night, I got up and wandered through the dark house. The moonlight spilled across the floor in long, pale streaks. I stood at the living room window, staring out at the quiet street. His house was dark. No lights, no movement. I wondered if he was lying awake too. Wondering what would happen next. The next morning, things felt delicate. My husband left earlier than usual, citing an early call. I watched him back out of the driveway and disappear around the corner. I didn't feel relief. I felt dread. Around 10, I opened the garage door to find the garden shears. One of the hedges had overgrown again, and I needed something to focus on. But when I stepped outside, he was there. Standing at the edge of my yard. He didn't approach. Just stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes soft but unreadable. I didn't speak. Finally, he took one step forward. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. I waited. "Do you want this to continue?" The question didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how unprepared I was to answer. My first instinct was to lie. To deflect. To ask what he meant. But I didn't. Instead, I said, "I don't know." He nodded once, as if he'd already guessed that would be my answer. "I'm not going to push," he said. "But I need to know where I stand. Because I can't go back to pretending nothing happened." "I'm not pretending," I whispered. "But you are," he said. "Every time you walk past me like I'm invisible, every time you close the door before I can knock. You're trying to undo something that can't be undone." He wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional. Just honest. And he was right. I didn't respond. I simply looked at him, and in that look, he must have seen everything I couldn't say aloud. He gave a small nod, then turned and walked away. I watched him go. When I went back inside, I sat on the couch and folded my hands tightly in my lap. I could still feel the echo of his words, the weight of them settling into my skin. That night, my husband came home with takeout. We ate on the couch. He told me about a colleague's promotion. I smiled and congratulated him. We watched a documentary. He fell asleep halfway through. I sat there beside him, staring at the screen but seeing nothing. And all I could think was, something has cracked open. And it's never going to close the same way again. I woke to the sound of birds outside the window, their calls sharp against the soft gray morning. It was still early. The bedroom was quiet, filled with that heavy kind of silence that comes after a night where nothing is said but everything is felt. My husband was still sleeping beside me, one arm curled under the pillow, breathing steady and slow. I watched him for a moment, wondering when the distance between us had become so wide. Wondering if he could feel it now, too. I rose carefully, stepping over the creaky board near the door like I had 100 times before. The house felt cold despite the warm air outside, and I pulled a sweater over my shoulders as I made my way into the kitchen. Light filtered through the curtains, painting long, golden lines across the table. I stood there, unmoving, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of pipes behind the walls. The photo album still sat on the dining table. I hadn't moved it since the day I found it, and something in me resisted the urge to put it away. It didn't feel like a memory anymore, it felt like a relic from another life, one I wasn't sure belonged to me. I sat down and opened it again, flipping slowly through the pages. Smiling faces. Vacations. Holidays. Our old dog, long gone now. So many captured moments, all neatly preserved and utterly silent. There was a photo from a winter trip, the two of us bundled in coats, laughing about something I could no longer remember. I stared at it until the edges blurred. At some point, I realized I was crying. Quiet, steady tears that I hadn't noticed until they hit the page. I wiped them away quickly, almost ashamed of the vulnerability, even in my own company. Later that morning, my husband left for the office. He kissed my forehead and asked if I wanted to go out for dinner that night. I said I'd think about it. He smiled, then walked out the door with the same casual rhythm he always had. As if everything was still in place. I watched him leave from the window. The moment the car turned the corner, I felt the shift again. That pull. That silent gravity that kept bringing me back to the same point. I didn't have a plan. I didn't pack a bag. I just put on my shoes and walked. It was early enough that the street was still quiet. A few sprinklers clicked on, sending arcs of water across driveways. Birds fluttered along fences. The neighborhood moved with the soft, unbothered pace of morning. I crossed the road slowly. When I reached his door, I hesitated. Not because I was unsure of what I was doing, but because I wasn't sure how to begin. I knocked lightly. He opened the door almost immediately, as if he'd been standing nearby. His expression didn't change, no surprise, no expectation. Just stillness. We stood there for a breath before he stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled the same. Paper, old wood, something faintly herbal. I walked in and stopped near the living room, unsure where to put myself. He moved past me, into the kitchen, and poured 2 glasses of water without asking. When he returned, he handed one to me. We sat on opposite sides of the room, the same way we always did, like a pattern we'd fallen into without meaning to. I thought about what you said, I said quietly. He nodded but said nothing. I don't have answers. Not ones that make sense. I didn't ask for answers, he replied. Only truth. I held the glass between my palms, the coolness grounding me. I'm not proud of what happened, I said. But I'm not pretending it didn't either. His eyes met mine. Calm, but not without pain. I never expected this, I continued. Not with you. Not with anyone. I know. I took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. I think I needed to feel something. To remember that I still could. That I was still real. I felt that too, he said. Silence stretched again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt like acknowledgement. I can't keep living in between, I said. Between him and you. Between the past and now. He looked away for a moment, then back. What do you want? The question sat between us, large and unmovable. I don't know, I admitted. But I know I can't undo any of this. And I don't want to lie to either of you. Not anymore. He nodded once. Then don't. We didn't say much else. I stayed a little longer. We drank our water. We sat in the quiet, the way people do when they've said what matters most and know nothing else can fix or change it. When I left, he walked me to the door. There was no goodbye. No plan for what came next. Only understanding. I returned home to an empty house. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty vase on the table, the one that had held daisies not long ago. I picked it up and carried it to the sink, rinsing it clean, watching the water swirl and disappear. That evening, my husband returned, cheerful in his familiar way. He suggested we go to the little Italian place near the park. I agreed. We sat at our usual table. Ordered our usual food. We talked about the neighbors, about weekend plans, about a documentary he wanted to watch. Everything felt easy. Everything felt safe. And yet, I could feel the distance. It wasn't something either of us said. It was something we both carried. Something that now existed between us, whether we acknowledged it or not. On the walk home, he took my hand. And I let him. Because part of me still loved him. But another part, the part that had opened in that quiet living room, in that stillness across the street, knew something had shifted. And some things, once broken open, never quite closed the same way again.